A major shakeup in the White House. The return of Donald Trump could mean many things for the future of Iran, and his cabinet picks are offering some clues. Marco Rubio as his choice for Secretary of State, Elise Stefanik, Mike Waltz, and many more names trickling in, all pro-Israel and against the Islamic Republic. The president-elect also nominating Fox News host and veteran Pete Hegseth as defense secretary. His choice breaking with long-standing tradition of Pentagon chiefs with long careers in government and the military. But maybe that's part of Trump's goal. What does that mean for the future of the world's most powerful country, and how will that impact Iran? We've got Major Andrew Fox, a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, a pundit on the Middle East, and a former soldier in the British Army. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Before we start, please give us a review on any podcast platform of your choice. Major Andrew Fox joins us now from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for being here.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Amazing. So, Major Fox, you served in Afghanistan alongside the Americans. What did that teach you about the region and about the importance or the influence of the Americans there?
That's a really tough one to start with. We were very much in a bubble, I think, in Afghanistan. We had our mission sets. So I did 3 tours there. I did 2 with the British Army and 1 attached to the Americans. And Helmandi culture down in the south is very different to maybe Kabul culture. And I think the first key lesson was that we can't make big assumptions that we fully understand anywhere when we come from outside of there. I think that's really important to note. We made some huge assumptions in kind of strategic and operational design. I'm talking at like NATO level here, maybe even government level, that actually just didn't pay off on the ground. And an example I'll give you is we assumed that if we introduced a democratic system, then that might take hold and the Afghans would embrace it. But actually it was up against all sorts of ties of tribe and religion and family and even other countries like the Pashtunistan area that bridges Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think some of the assumptions we made were just really flawed. And so I think that's my key takeaway is you can't assume that you know everywhere about a country if you're not from that country. And it's very dangerous to do any military planning off the back of those assumptions.
Well, that's a brilliant and very critical and important takeaway. And I asked that question because I think it's going to really help set the stage for us in terms of looking at Trump's picks, his appointees, and what that means for the future of the Middle East, specifically Iran, for Israel, and all this talk that we're hearing about, regime change or not regime change, going after a nuclear Iran. So let's start with Pete Hegseth, Trump's pick for defense secretary. There are some Republicans who welcomed him, and there are others who were quite surprised, to say the least. Given your background with the military and your real life experience and your insight into the Middle East, what are your thoughts on his pick? What did you make of it?
It's a strange one, and I don't buy that you have to have been in the military to do the job of defense secretary. It's a far more strategic level position than necessarily having a requirement to understand exactly how military operations work, because that's what generals are for. That's what their job is, to do the military strategic piece. In terms of a political operator, he's not been in hugely high level political positions, so I'm going to expect some missteps early from him. That's very common. We're seeing that in the UK at the moment with our government, who've been out of power for 14 years and now they're back in power, and they're relearning how being in government works, and that's going to be a really steep learning curve for the new Secretary of Defense in the US. My one concern is that he doesn't have a huge amount of kind of management experience. I mean, this is an organisation as big as Walmart, and you wouldn't pluck someone off the street and make them managing director of Walmart.
That's a great analogy.
And I can start, and all credit to Tessa, my colleague, who came up with it, and I've flagrantly stolen it. But yeah, it does make life really tricky for him, I think. So I think it's an interesting appointment. My biggest concern is that he doesn't have the skill set needed, and potentially it's a political appointment for loyalty rather than ability, which is never a good place to be.
And what impact will that have on the Islamic Republic of Iran? How will adversaries like Iran view a pick like that with the inexperience that you just pointed out here? Will that make America's military vulnerable then?
No, I don't think so, because as I said, it's the generals and the admirals and the air marshals who will do the kind of strategic level military planning. I don't think a huge amount will actually change within the US Army initially. I mean, if they have a purge of perceived politically incorrect senior officers, that could be a real hit on capability, because that sort of experience and knowledge is quite hard to replace in the short term. But I think I'm slightly more reassured by the fact that Marco Rubio is the new Secretary of State. I mean, he does know what he's doing. He's been in politics a long time. He's had a very consistent line on the Middle East, and most of the stuff he's said in the past I kind of agree with. So, I mean, I don't think there'll be a huge immediate change in position towards Iran, but potentially I suspect the nuclear deal might be coming back off the table as it did under the last Trump presidency. That would be the first big change I would expect to see.
Now, would that set the course then for potentially another battlefield when it comes to Iran and preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power? Because, I mean, we've heard Trump say before he's not in it for regime change, but he will not allow Iran to become a nuclear power. We've heard the same thing from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What does Trump's pick for then Marco Rubio indicate when it comes to that?
I think we can see a degree of consistency with what Trump did last time. I don't think, if anything, his position will be solidified after the Iranian regime's behaviour over the last year against Israel. Obviously, this is the most pro-Israeli cabinet in American history, I would imagine. I can't think of one that's been more explicitly pro-Israel. So I think, should there be another rocket attack directly on Israel, I can imagine that the response will be potentially even joint rather than just Israeli. I think there's potential for that. This is absolute speculation ultimately, but I would say starting with increased sanctions, and then we have to deal with that nuclear issue you've raised. And the issue, of course, with that is that those sites are actually very well hidden and protected, and Iran is not far from having enough fissile material to make a weapon. And it's entirely possible they might see a window closing and make a rush for it right now. And of course, if you strike those nuclear sites, you have to be certain that you get all of them simultaneously, because the program's so advanced that actually Iran could still make their way to a bomb, even with a degraded capability, because it's been struck militarily. So it's a really nuanced and tricky situation.
Yeah, it is very tricky. And as you said, I think it's safe to assume that, of course, we're going to start with economic sanctions from Trump, more diplomatic pressure and isolation for Iran. And given that Israel has pretty much decimated Iran's deterrence with Hezbollah and Hamas, would that in some way, like you said, push them into acquiring nukes a lot faster? Could that have like an unintended consequence?
Yeah, certainly that's potential. And again, I'm informed guessing rather than making a prediction based on the thinking of the Ayatollah. I don't have his cell phone number, but the issue here, I think, is that there's an unpredictability that has caught everyone off guard. I don't think anyone predicted what would happen after October the 7th. I think even once the massacre had happened, and even after 8th of October when Hezbollah opened fire, I don't think people necessarily saw this going on for 12 months plus. And whilst everyone knew about Iran's proxy network that they'd set up around the Middle East, it wasn't exactly a secret that they'd done this. I don't think anyone expected them to all come into action simultaneously quite so soon. So that unpredictability in Tehran is the really kind of that's what makes it so hard to predict what's going to happen in the immediate future.
That's a really good point. And speaking of, unpredictability, let's talk about Tulsi Gabbard as head of the CIA. Just a few years ago, she actually tweeted that she was against the Trump administration's decision to assassinate General Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force. What do you make of that pick?
My hope is that the comments she's made in the past have been playing to a political audience rather than something she actually thinks, because she said pro-Assad things. She said some very strange things about Ukraine, some weird conspiracy theory stuff about biolabs and all that kind of buffoonery that you see repeated on the internet. So My aspiration here is that she was doing it on purpose to play to a crowd, and actually her real life views are a lot more sensible. Because if she actually believes that stuff, then that's a really dangerous and bad appointment by President Trump.
Where do you think we're going here in terms of the United States and Iran with these appointees? And of course, like you said you can't predict the future, but this is giving us some clues into what might become of the future of U.S. Iran policy.
Yeah, I think it's going to be continuity 2020. I think we'll quickly go back to where we were at the end of the last Trump presidency, with Iran increasingly isolated on the world stage, with diplomatic moves being made to kind of tie up the more amenable Arab states into a legalization and an acknowledgement of Israel's existence. But the first thing that needs to happen is that a war in Israel needs to stop, because that makes it almost politically impossible for Mohammed bin Salman or whoever in Saudi or even the countries that have signed the Abraham Accords. It makes it very difficult for them to agree to anything with Israel, because their base is so anti what's happening. There's an Arab solidarity on the streets that condemns what Israel's doing in Gaza and to an extent Lebanon. So that's the first thing that needs to happen, is that war needs to come to an end. Does Trump have any levers to pull to force it to finish sooner than it would otherwise? I mean, potentially, would America have more direct involvement? I mean, it would be controversial if they did, but it's an option. I think a peace deal with Hezbollah is the first step, and then we'll see if Mr. Trump holds Qatar or whoever hosts Hamas's leadership to account once they've taken over the White House. So we'll see. It's not a clear answer, but it's a very, very difficult question to give you a comprehensive and confident answer.
Of course, no, I totally understand. And if those wars and those fronts end, could that then open up the door for Netanyahu and the United States to start one with Iran?
Yeah, potentially. But again, if we look at the regime change problems that we've kind of alluded to already, regime change is exceptionally challenging, because if you knock off a regime, then you create a vortex. And so you have to have something there to fill that vortex that is consistent and compelling, because otherwise you end up spending 20 years there and, for example, replacing the Taliban with the Taliban. So regime change, what I think we've learned is since 2001, we've learned that regime change is a really dangerous and unpredictable thing, and it's a really foolish endeavour to embark on if you don't have a really solid plan for what comes next. And I don't think there is for Iran. Clearly, there's a popular groundswell of support for removing the Ayatollah, but they've got 500,000 men under arms. And if they show, even half of those show loyalty to the regime, then you can decapitate it, but someone else will just step in and it'll be business as usual. So regime change is really tricky. I think far more likely is an isolation approach, where Iran gets increasingly cut off from the world in terms of sanctions and diplomatic measures.
And are there some potentially contradictions with President-elect Donald Trump? For example, he has been appointing people who appear to be more America first. I spoke to some analysts who said, who he didn't pick, for example, Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, is also very telling, because they're known as neoconservatives who do want to get involved in global affairs. But then he's got this, of course, commitment to Israel. Are we seeing a contradiction here of Donald Trump?
No, I think it's a commitment to peace and a sort of an increasing American, America first policy, but with an exception where Israel is almost portrayed as an outpost of America, which I don't think is helpful for the Israelis. I don't think it's helpful for their long-term aims in the region, but it'll be helpful in the short term because it might bring this war to a swifter conclusion. But it certainly doesn't help the narratives that Israel faces in terms of being a colony or an American puppet. That's really unhelpful. But we've seen the noise about Ukraine and forcing effectively a ceasefire there. And as you say, the appointments that he's made suggest that he's picking people who are more of the America first mindset. So I think it'll be America first, except Israel, would be my kind of best guess.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And you spoke about MBS and the Saudis. we've recently been seeing some sort of the Iranians and the Saudis kind of getting cozy with each other. There were some joint naval exercises, which is a huge deal for people who know Iran and Saudi Arabia and their history. That's a very big deal. We even heard MBS say that he wants Israel to respect, quote unquote, Iran's sovereignty. And then behind the scenes, there seems to be some sort of relationship or closeness between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And they were just days away from signing the Abraham Accords before October 7th. With Trump coming in January, could we see then a flip and a complete shift in the Middle East again? And towards a more peaceful Middle East, like you said.
Yeah, potentially it's on the table. And, Saudi are very good at playing both sides. And if I refer you to my earlier point about Afghanistan and about how you can never completely understand a region, I think the Middle East is the most complex area in the world. There's always a wheel within the wheel. And when you think you found all the other wheels, there's always another wheel that you stumble across in due course. But the Saudis are good both sides players. They're strategically very switched on. And the fact that they know that there's certainly instability that's Iranian fomented around Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. They know that it makes sense right now to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So that makes perfect sense that they've been cooperating with Iran to a greater extent, because Iran are on the ascendancy actually over the last year. They've flexed their muscles, and yes, Hezbollah have taken a kicking, and yes, Iran has been on the wrong end of pretty strong retaliation from the Israelis, but they're still pretty untouched since the start of 7th of October war onwards. I suspect MBS will read the tea leaves when Mr. Trump is back in, and if Mr. Trump is withdrawing from the nuclear deal, if Mr. Trump is throwing his weight behind Israel, I suspect MBS will kind of read the room and will adjust Saudi strategy accordingly.
You said keep your friends close and your enemies even closer. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, what is your assessment of, is Israel more of an enemy for them, or is Iran?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think they'll go straight to really clinical and cold realpolitik, and they'll look at the situation as it stands, and they'll make a very cold assessment of which of these two countries is the one that they want to draw closer. And that's where America comes into play again, because if America is really pushing for kind of the Abraham Accords Part 2, Saudi, of course, were in favour of this stuff 4 years ago. Countries like Bahrain would never sign a deal if the Saudis didn't give them the go-ahead. I mean, Bahrain gets 75% of its GDP gifted to it by Saudi Arabia. They don't do anything without Saudi say-so. So, yes, I can see them drawing closer to Israel in time. As I said, it will need the dust from Gaza to settle first. And actually, there might be a role and an opportunity for Saudi to play in the reconstruction of Gaza, because it is absolutely leveled. There's no pretending that it's not in absolute ruins, and somebody's going to have to rebuild it. Yeah, it's a great opportunity for Saudi to get involved in the reconstruction of Gaza. They've got the financial flex. They've got a public support for that, I would suggest. People are very upset about what's happened in Gaza in Saudi Arabia. And what that also does is it will cut out potentially more malign Gulf states like Qatar, or even the Chinese, because the last thing Israel want is huge amounts of money and supplies coming from those countries right on their doorstep. But it's going to be a really tricky one. That's probably the real kind of overarching question in this Israeli war, is what happens to Gaza after the war, the shooting phase is finished.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have made the assessment that Donald Trump, in terms of becoming the next president for his second administration, doesn't really think about necessarily the day after plan, right?
Mm. Yeah, and he's just sent Mike Huckabee to be the ambassador. He's a guy that said that Palestine doesn't exist. There's no such thing as the West Bank. It's just Judea and Samaria, and that's a very clear direction of travel. That's not particularly helpful for a long-term peace process. So right now, Trump isn't showing that he really gives any kind of a damn about the Palestinian issue. which, yeah, I mean, that might suit Netanyahu right now, but I don't think it suits a longer term strategy to achieve more harmony in that part of the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know that my contacts in Israel have been saying it looks like the White House is more pro-Israel than they are in Israel themselves. That's what a
Yeah.
lot of people are actually saying right now there on the ground. And given your knowledge of the Middle East, your experience of the military, what is your assessment then of Iran? And you talked about how complex the region is. How do you view Iran?
From a military perspective, the proxy system is entirely key to how they operate, because actually in military terms they've got a lot of numbers, but their equipment is dated. Their fighter jets are from the 50s, 60s and 70s. Their navy is equally dated. And in terms of having a direct fight, we've got the Iran-Iraq war that we can go back to, where a not particularly good Iraqi army held them to a stalemate. So in terms of their ability to fight, it's pretty small. The Israeli F-35s went through their defenses like butter just a few weeks ago, and yeah, if it comes to a straight shootout, there's only one winner. However, that's why they built their proxy strategy. It was a noose around Israel. It was effectively creating puppet states all over the region. You know, Iraq is essentially an Iranian client now. Lebanon has this vampiric Hezbollah organization who are sucking the life out of that country. And Yemen is under Houthi control. So, you know, these tentacles of the octopus have been really, really effective in enacting Iranian foreign policy in a way that their own domestic armed forces never could.
Yeah, and you mentioned obviously the proxies, but what about the Iranian establishment's mentality? When you look at the proxies, that's more of an indication of, there's another saying that Iran will fight Israel to the very last Arab. They're not going to put their own people out. They're known for being passive aggressive. Could Trump's kind of macho and maximum pressure strategy work in terms of scaring the Iranian establishment? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, we know that the policy of appeasement with the Biden-Harris administration has only further emboldened them, a lot of experts say.
Yeah, I think there's a golden rule in the Middle East that strength is paramount, and demonstrations of strength are important strategically as well. And Trump has shown that he's not scared to flex that muscle. I mean, I think it's hard to underestimate just how much better the US military is than any other armed force in the world, in terms of their carrier, their strategic reach, the weaponry they have, their budget. If they're the number one military budget in the world, and it's more than the next 9 in the top 10. That's how much they spend and how powerful they are. And I can absolutely see Trump flexing that muscle. But the question is for when dealing with Iran is what they target. Because we've already talked about the dangers of regime change if you don't have somebody else to kind of replace who you're taking out. The nuclear sites we've spoken about, they're really hard to hit. And you have to do a very comprehensive job, or don't do it at all, because otherwise you run the risk of the regime rushing for a nuke with what they've got left. You could try and hit the oil, but that oil is still making its way to the world market in spite of any sanctions, which means that if you hit the Iranian oil distribution centres, you're going to send the price of oil through the roof, which is going to upset people all around the world because they're paying more for their petrol. Ditto gas is already under strain because of what's happening in Ukraine, and the last thing anyone needs is gas prices skyrocketing as winter comes. And then that leaves you with very few targets to hit, actually. You could start hitting Iranian infrastructure, but all that's going to do is make life for everyday Iranians more difficult, and nobody wants to do that. So, it's not quite as simple as saying we're going to flex our muscle with Iran. It's how and against what do you actually flex that muscle. And so if we look at the 3 levers of diplomatic, economic and military, I actually think it's far more likely that diplomatic and economic will be used rather than military in the first instance.
And will that force Iran's hand, or will they double down? Do you think that they're actually going to talk to Donald Trump? I mean, in 2019, Trump tried really hard to talk to the Iranians. He even, I think, brought over, it was Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, and Khamenei, basically the supreme leader, told him off and had that on camera to do that, which I guess maybe for him it may have been a powerful stance, but it really did nothing for Iran at the end of the day.
Yeah, I don't see a meaningful dialogue. I mean, the great Satan and little Satan narrative has been well set in stone since the 80s, if not before. And they don't actually need to talk to Donald Trump. They just need to dial back their aggression. And I think that is what the aim of any American efforts will be. It will be to deheat that Iranian influence that is sparking off so much conflict in the Middle East right now. And I think if they can achieve that, then that's probably the best example of what a win looks like.
Sounds like that's probably their number one goal. But I also wanted to mention, I've talked to a lot of Iranian Americans who voted Trump, people who were very liberal but voted for him because A, they weren't happy with how the Biden-Harris administration dealt with Iran, and B, because they truly feel, even people inside Iran that I've spoken to, truly believe that with the coming of Donald Trump, somehow that is going to, I don't know, do something to the Iranian establishment, to the government, to the regime, and we're going to see change. But it really doesn't sound like you think that that's going to happen or that that's even feasible.
No, exactly that. I don't think it'll happen, and I don't think it's feasible. But I think um, if you set as an end state the reduction in violence in the region, if you degrade Iran's proxy capabilities around the region, and if you make the regime poorer, this is going to be the first baby steps in some kind of regime change further down the line. I mean, I don't think we're at a point yet where we can articulate a clear pathway to Iran finding its way back to where it was in decades gone before. Um, but what we have to do is make sure that Iran can't destabilize outside its borders, and then we can turn our attentions to a very long road to fixing what's going wrong inside its borders. Um, so yeah, it's not the most hopeful of messaging for your listeners, but let's be realistic, and small gains to start with is how every journey starts with a first step, and so let's work out what the practical first steps are, and then we can look at how we go on with this journey as time progresses.
Yeah, so what you're saying is through Trump, you have those first baby steps. And I'm really
Hmm.
curious, you just came back from Israel, you toured the tunnels of Hezbollah, which I think they destroyed
Hmm.
after, so I think you were the only one of the only few that got to see that. Tell us
Yeah.
about that, and I'm really interested to know what that taught you in terms of the threat of the Iranian regime too.
Yeah, well, really interestingly, since I got back, I did some work with an Irish journalist who's really good with the imagery stuff, and he looked at the electrics. I took videos of some of the electrics down there, and he's identified those parts as Iranian. So the fuse box was Iranian. There's a timer switch that he found as Iranian, and the light fixtures on the walls were the only website he could find them on was one from Iran. So there's a really clear really clear connection. I mean, we know Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. This isn't a shock, but the scale of which Iran is supplying them perhaps is slightly surprising there. And the really key takeaway from seeing that tunnel is that it wasn't designed to fight in. Okay, it had no defensive features. It had no bunker positions outside. It had no fighting positions inside. It was just one long straight tunnel with no kinks to prevent enfilade fire. So what does that mean? What was it used for if it's not a fighting tunnel? Well, it's a staging post. So it's full of uniforms, it's full of ammunition, it's full of bed down locations for fighters. And the best assessment I can make is that what they were going to do was have fighters come there in civilian clothing, get changed into uniform in the tunnels, and then use the tunnel to launch an attack into Israel downhill. It's a very strategic hill. It sort of points straight down into Israel. And it is actually a perfect attack location. So my assessment, and I think the IDF made the same, is that this was an attack tunnel where it was going to facilitate an Iranian-backed attack into Israel in the style of 7th of October down in the Gaza envelope.
Wow, so that was potentially Iran's plan for their another front. Wow, and as
Yeah,
you
exactly
mentioned,
that.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, as you mentioned, like, yes, Hezbollah is an Iran proxy. Yes, we know that they're very involved and orchestrated that, but I had no idea the extent at which
Mm.
Iran's presence in Lebanon was. That's jaw dropping for me. Wow.
Yeah, fingers all over it, and you can see the influence. I mean, the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon. I don't know if you saw the photos of him
I did,
yesterday,
yes.
where He's lost his fingers and he's got facial scar, and clearly the beep beep got him as well. So, absolutely integrated into Hezbollah's command structure.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else you'd like to add on this topic that we haven't touched on?
No, not really. I mean, only that I'm just sad that it's fairly pessimistic when it comes to Iran, and I hope that there is a resolution to this in due course, and that's what I'll be hoping for the next 4 years under the new president.
No, I appreciate your honesty, your realism, your insight, and your expertise and your real life experience, being on the ground, being in the military, and just as a human being yourself, right? Because that's you're a human being before anything, right?
Not if you believe my Twitter replies on some days, but yeah, I do try.
No, we really appreciate it. And as you said, it looks like the next 4 years and these pics of Trump kind of indicate, like you said, more pressure, and not necessarily military pressure, but the first kind of baby steps before people start to see potentially some change in the region.
Exactly so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Tell us what you thought about this episode in the comments. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.